We are in Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom G. Scholem. We are continuing Hasidism, the latest phase, inflicting all manner of ridicule and shame on them, turning somersaults in the streets and marketplaces of Kolusk and Diosna, and generally permitting themselves all sorts of pranks and practical jokes in public. And yet, there is an all-important difference between even these radical groups and the Sabbateans. Their motives are entirely different. For the followers of the great Maggid, Messianism as an active force of immediate appeal no longer had any importance. The mood that inspired them and scandalized their opponents was the primitive enthusiasm of mystical friends of God. I have already mentioned the fact that, in its beginnings, Hasidism bore a good many revivalist traits. Its founder had evolved a new form of religious consciousness in which rabbinical learning, whatever its intrinsic significance, played no essential part. For the foundations of his immediate experience, he went back to the Kabbalistic books, which helped him to give expression to his emotional enthusiasm. He follows the ideas of the Tsim of God, the uplifting of the fallen sparks, the conception of Devakuth as the highest religious value, and other notions of which we have already heard. For the soaring flight of the soul from the worlds created in the act of Tzim, there are no limits. He who serves God in the great way assembles all his inner power and rises upwards in his thoughts and breaks through all skies in one act and rises higher than the angels and the seraphs and the thrones, and that is the perfect worship. And in prayer, and in the commandment which one keeps, there is a great and small way, but the great way is that of right preparation and enthusiasm, through which he unites himself with the upper worlds. The clearest reflection of this enthusiasm is to be found in the Hasidic prayer, which strikes one as an almost complete antithesis of the form of mystical prayer, which was developed at about the same time in Jerusalem by the Sephardic Kabbalist of Beth El. The later is all restraint, the former all movement. It would be almost possible to speak of a contrast between the sunken and ecstatic moods in the literal meaning of the term ecstatic, to be out of one's mind, were it not for the reflection that such extreme opposites are always two sides of the same thing. To the Hasidic mind, Devakuth and Kawana were primarily emotional values, a significance which they had by no means always had before. That is the meaning of Devakuth, that when he fulfills the commandments or studies the Torah, the body becomes a throne for the soul, and the soul a throne for the light of the Shekinah, which is above his head, and the light, as it were, flows all around him, and he sits in the midst of the light and rejoices in trembling. The first 50 years of Hasidism, after its founder's death, 1760 to 1810, its truly heroic period, are characterized by this spirit of enthusiasm which expressed and at the same time justified itself by stressing the old idea of the immanence of God in all that exists. But this enthusiasm was anything but messianic. It was not based on chiliastic expectations. Here is the explanation of the fact that when it came into conflict, as it could hardly fail to do, with the sober and somewhat pedestrian spirit of rabbinical orthodoxy, typified by the Lithuanian brand, it more than held its own. We have seen how Sabbateanism centered round the hope of a mystical redemption. On this issue, no compromise was possible or even conceivable. With the shelving of the messianic element, an understanding between rabbinical and mystical Judaism was no longer ruled out. From a possibility, it became a reality after the Hasidic movement had outgrown its first stormy period of growth, and from active revivalism turned to religious organization. If still on a pneumatic and mystical basis, here and there an individual became the bearer of messianic hopes, but the movement as a whole had made its peace with the Galuth, Yet it is this period of Hasidism, the period of the Tzadikism, of the Tzadikim and their dynasties, which, in certain important respects, is closer to Sabbateanism than the earlier stages of the movement. It is particularly the episode of Frankism which makes for a certain similarity. Sabbateanism, as we know, perished not in a cloud of glory, but in the tragedy of the Frankist movement, whose founder incarnates all the hideous potentialities of a corrupted, despotic messianism. Jacob Frank, 1726 to 1791, is a messiah with a thirst for power. Indeed, his greedy lust for power dominated him to the exclusion of every other motive. It is this which makes his personality at once so fascinating and so ignoble. There is a certain demonic grandeur about this man. The quality that set him apart from Sabbatai's V is well expressed in a remark attributed to him. If Sabbatai's V, he is reported to have said, had to taste everything in the world, why did he not taste the sweetness of power? This almost sensuous love for power, which Frank possessed in the highest degree, is the stigma of nihilism. To Frank, the grand gesture of the ruler is everything. What matters here is that the development of Tzadikism after Hasidism has become the religious organization of large masses, took a similar course. True, the unlimited power and authority of the Tzadik over his followers was not purchased at the price of such destructive paradoxes as Frank had to uphold. Tzadikism was able to attain its goal without coming into open conflict with the basic tenets of traditional Judaism, and it's not quite the same thing as the pre-rabbinic Tzadikism, right? But this fact should not blind us to its doctrinal implications. Lust for power is active even among those profound theoreticians of Tzadikism who developed the doctrine of the Tzadik, the saint and spiritual leader of the Hasidic community, as the non-messianic Messiah, and characteristically carried it to its extreme. A man of genius like Rabbi Nachman of Braslav impresses us by his extravagant references to the power of the Tzadik, but he does so because in his case one sense is an obvious concern for the spiritual aspects of Tzadikism. With many others, however, the spiritual character is only faintly or not at all recognizable, and the greatest and most impressive figure of classical Tzadikism, Israel of Rishon, the so-called rabbi of Sadagora, is, to put it bluntly, nothing but another Jacob Frank, who has achieved the miracle of remaining an Orthodox Jew. All the mysteries of the Torah have disappeared, or rather, they are overshadowed and absorbed by the magnificent gesture of the born ruler. He is still witty and quick at repartee, but the secret of his power is the mystery of the magnetic and dominant personality, and not that of the fascinating teacher. Section 4. But I am running ahead of my own thoughts. Let us return for a moment to the question what Hasidism means and what it does not mean. There are two things about the movement which are particularly remarkable. One is the fact that within a geographically small area and also within a surprisingly short period, the ghetto gave birth to a whole galaxy of saint mystics, each of them a startling individuality. The incredible intensity of creative religious feeling, which manifested itself in Hasidism between 1750 and 1800 of the Common Era, produced a wealth of truly original religious types, which, as far as one can judge, surpassed even the harvest of the classical period of Safed. Something like a rebellion of religious energy against petrified religious values must have taken place. No less surprising, however, is the fact that this burst of mystical energy was unproductive of new religious ideas, to say nothing of new theories of mystical knowledge. If you were to ask me what is the new doctrine of these mystics, whose experience was obviously firsthand, more so perhaps than in the case of many of their predecessors, what were their new principles and ideas? I say, if you were to ask me this, I should hardly know what to answer. In the previous lectures, it was always possible to lay down a blueprint, so to speak, of the spiritual architecture of the subject matter and to give a more or less precise definition of its ideational side. In the case of Hasidism, certainly a creative religious movement, we cannot do so without repeating ourselves innumerable times. It is precisely this fact which makes Hasidism a special problem for our interpretation. The truth is that it is not always possible to distinguish between the revolutionary and the conservative elements of Hasidism, or rather Hasidism as a whole is as much a reformation of earlier mysticism as it is more or less the same thing. You can say, if you like, that it depends on how you look at it. The Hasidim were themselves aware of this fact, even such a novel thing as the rise of the Tzaddikim, and the doctrine of Tzaddikism appeared to them as being, despite its novelty, well, in the Kabbalistic tradition. So much seems clear that the followers of these Hasidim became genuine revivalists. Rabbi Israel of Koznitz, a typical Kabbalist among the Tzaddikim, used to say that he had read 800 Kabbalistic books before coming to his teacher, the great Maggid of Meseritz, but that he had really learned nothing from them. If, however, you merely read his books, you will not find the slightest doctrinal difference between his teachings and those of the old authors whom he affected to despise. The new element must therefore not be sought on the theoretical and literary plane, but rather in the experience of an inner revival, in the spontaneity of feeling generated in sensitive minds by the encounter with the living incarnations of mysticism. A good deal of light is thrown on the attitude of the Hasidim to the question of their relationship, or that of their great teachers, to Kabbalism as a whole, by the testimony of Solomon of Luzik, who edited the writings of the Maggid of Meseritz. On the one hand, he reproves the later Kabbalists for their supercilious attitude toward earlier documents of Kabbalism, but then again he seems to regard the writings of Rabbi Bar of Meseritz as purely Kabbalistic and not at all as a new departure. Speaking generally, one does get the impression from reading Hasidic authors that the continuity of Kabbalistic thoughts was not really interrupted. Again, it would be quite wrong to regard as the original and novel contribution of Hasidism to religion the fact that it popularized the Kabbalistic ideas of a mystical life with God and in God. Though it be true that this tendency had celebrated its greatest triumph in the Hasidic movement and its literature, its antecedents go farther back. Too little attention is given to the fact that the popularization of certain mystical ideas had begun long before the rise of Hasidism, and that about the time of its first appearance, it had already found its most magnificent literary incarnation. I am thinking here of the now almost forgotten writings of Yehuda Loew ben Bezalel of Prague, about 1520 to 1609, the exalted Rabbi Loew of the Scholem legend. In a sense, one could say that he was the first Hasidic writer. It is certainly no accident that so many Hasidic saints had a penchant for his writings. Some of his more voluminous tracts, such as the great book Gevaroth Adonai, the mighty deeds of God, seemed to have no other purpose than to express Kabbalistic ideas without making too much use of Kabbalistic terminology. In this, he succeeded so well that not a few modern students have failed to perceive the Kabbalistic character of his writings. Some have gone so far as to deny that he occupied himself with Kabbalistic thought at all. Now, one thing that you step aside from, if you go straight to the text rather than the conservative things, is this thing where you don't say the name of God. You could say straight up Yahweh, or however you're going to pronounce that. You don't have to say Adonai or Hashem or Metz. Putz, or is that how you say the? Anyways, the Hasidim themselves did not go so far in the popularization of Kabbalistic thought as exalted Rabbi Loew, who appears to have renounced the Kabbalistic vocabulary only in order to give the widest possible range of influence to the Kabbalistic doctrine. They too, on occasion, depart from the classical terminology of Kabbalism, especially where it had become petrified. There is no subtlety and ambiguity in their writings which is not found in earlier authors, but on the whole they stuck fairly close to the old formula. If one studies the writings of Rabbi Bar of Meseritz, the most important follower of the Baal Shem and the real organizer of the movement, one sees immediately that in them the old ideas and conceptions, all of which duly make their appearance, have lost their stiffness and received a new infusion of life by going through the fiery stream of a truly mystical mind. Even this popularization of the Kabbalistic vocabulary, however, is not a specific product of the Hasidic movement, but one that dates back to the literature of the so-called Musar books, moralizing tracts, particularly those written during the century before the rise of Hasidism. There you get the works and pamphlets on moral conduct and Jewish ethics, which were written for a broader public. Previously, I said that since the period of Safed, this kind of literature was for the most part written by men who were under Kabbalistic influence and whose writings propagated doctrines and values peculiar to Kabbalism, since the Hasidim drew much more on these books than on the metaphysical and theosophical literature of Kabbalism. An analysis of Hasidic doctrines cannot afford to pass them by. Unfortunately, no serious attempt has been made to establish the true relation between the traditional and the novel elements in Hasidic thought. The one known to me has failed completely. In the absence of a competent scholarly work on the question, one is reduced to dangerous generalizations from more or less vague impressions and occasional intuitive glimpses of the situation. The impression one gets is that no element of Hasidic thought is entirely new, while at the same time everything has somewhat been transformed. Certain ideas are more strongly emphasized than before, while others have been regulated to the background. A consistent attitude inspires these changes, and we have to ask ourselves wherein it is to be found. If one leaves out of account the lone effort at religious orientation made by Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Ladi and his school, the so-called Chabad Hasidism, Hasidism seems to have produced no truly original Kabbalistic thought whatever. However, this interesting attempt to arrive at something like a synthesis of Isaac Luria and the Maggid of Meseritz, despite the fact that it stands alone, provides, in fact, the best starting point for our investigation. It gives a new emphasis to psychology instead of theosophy, a fact which must be deemed of the highest importance. To put it as briefly as possible, the distinctive feature of the new school is to be found in the fact that the secrets of the divine realm are presented in the guise of mystical psychology. It is by descending into the depths of his own self that man wanders through all the dimensions of the world. In his own self, he lifts the barriers which separate one sphere from the other. In his own self, finally, he transcends the limits of natural existence, and at the end of his way, without, as it were, a single step beyond himself, he discovers that God is all in all, and there is nothing but him. With every one of the endless stages of the theosophical world corresponding to a given state of the soul, actual or potential, but at any rate capable of being felt and perceived, Kabbalism becomes an instrument of psychological analysis and self-knowledge, an instrument the precision of which is not infrequently rather astounding. What gives the writings of the Chabad school their distinctive feature is the striking mixture of enthusiastic worship of God and pantheistic, or rather a cosmistic, interpretation of the universe on the one hand, and an intense preoccupation with the human mind and its impulses on the other. Something of this attitude is indeed common to the whole Hasidic movement, and even though the majority of its followers rejected the mood of religious intoxication peculiar to the Chabad mystics, whose theoretical outlook struck them as being a little too scholastic and strained, this much then can be said. In the Hasidic movement, Kabbalism appears no longer in a theosophical guise, or to be more exact, theosophy with all its complicated theories, if it is not entirely dropped, is at least no longer the focal point of the religious consciousness, where it continues to play a prominent part, as for instance in the school of Rabbi Zevi Hirsch of Zidiakzo, who died in 1830. It is bound up with some belated offshoot of the older Kabbalah within the framework of Hasidism. What has really become important is the direction, the mysticism of the personal life. Hasidism is practical mysticism at its highest. Almost all the Kabbalistic ideas are now placed in relation to values peculiar to the individual life, and those which are not remain empty and ineffective. Particular emphasis is laid on ideas and concepts concerning the relation of the individual to God. All this centers around the concept of what the Kabbalists call Devakuth, the meaning of which I have tried to explain in previous lectures, the comparatively few terms of religious expression which date back to Hasidism, such as Hith, Lahavuth, enthusiasm or ecstasy, and Hithazkuth, self-maintenance, are related to this sphere. There is much truth in Buber's remark in the first of his Hasidic books that Hasidism represents Kabbalism turned ethos, but a further ingredient was needed to make Hasidism what it was. Ethical Kabbalism can also be found in the moralizing and propagandist literature of Lurianism, which I have mentioned, yet it would be stretching the term too far to call this Hasidic. What gave Hasidism its peculiar note was primarily the foundation of a religious community on the basis of a paradox common to the history of such movements as the sociology of religious groupings has shown. Briefly, the originality of Hasidism lies in the fact that the mystics who had attained their spiritual aim, who in Kabbalistic parlance had discovered the secret of true Devakuth, turned to the people with their mystical knowledge, their Kabbalism become ethos, and instead of cherishing as a mystery the most personal of all experiences, undertook to teach its secret to all men of goodwill. Nothing is further from the truth than the view which regards Tzadikism, that is to say, the unlimited religious authority of an individual in a community of believers, as foreign to the nature of Hasidism, and insists that one must distinguish between the pure Hasidism of the Baal Shem and the depraved Tzadikism of his followers and their followers. The Simon pure Hasidism never existed because anything like it could never have influenced more than a few people. The truth is that the later development of Tzadikism was already implicit in the very start of the Hasidic movement. As soon as the mystic felt the urge to perpetuate his personal and solitary experience in the life of a community which he addressed not in his language but in its own, a new factor made its appearance, round which the mystical movement as a social phenomenon could and did crystallize. The believers no longer needed the Kabbalah. He turned its mysteries into reality by fastening upon certain traits which the saint or tzaddik, whose example he strove to follow, had placed in the center of his relation to God. Everyone thus, the doctrine ran, must try to become the embodiment of a certain ethical quality. Attributes like piety, service, love, devotion, humility, clemency, trust, even greatness and domination became in this way enormously real and socially effective. Already in the medieval Jewish literature, as we have seen in the third lecture, the radical or extreme practice of a good deed or mitzvah is mentioned as characteristic of the idea of Hasiduth. The modern Hasid certainly showed himself worthy of the name. Certain religious values were pushed so far and became symbolical of so much ardor and piety that the realization sufficed to bring about the mystical experience of Devakuth. All is demanded from the first, and particularly during the most creative and virile period of the movement, the existence of the tzaddik or saint as actual proof of the possibility of living up to the ideal, the whole energy and sympathy of emotion and thought, which in the case of the Orthodox Kabbalist went to the exploration of the theosophical mysteries, was turned about in the quest for the true substance of ethico-religious conceptions and for their mystical glorification. The true originality of Hasidic thought is to be found here and nowhere else. As mystical moralists, the Hasidism found a way to social organization. Again, we see that the ancient paradox of solitude and communion, he who has attained the highest degree of spiritual solitude, who is capable of being alone with God, is the true center of the community because he has reached the stage at which striking communion becomes possible. Hasidism produced a wealth of striking and original formulations of this paradox formula, which bear the mark of the utmost sincerity, but which, with the decay of the movement, became only too easily a screen for the more sinister potentialities of saintly existence, to live among ordinary men and yet be alone with God, to speak profane language and yet draw the strength to live from the source of existence, from the upper root of the soul, that is a paradox which the mystical devotee is able to realize in his life and which makes him the center of the community of men. And so we run into the simple fact of that a mysticism that's escapism, has caused so many problems for so many people that it's about time to make it an embodiment, and drop the thing about having to go elsewhere. It's all part of oneself, or it can be. 5. To sum up the following points of importance for our characterization of the Hasidic movement: 1. A burst of original religious enthusiasm in a revivalist movement which drew its strength from the people. 2. The relation of the true illuminate who becomes a popular leader and the center of the community to the believers whose life centers round his religious personality. This paradoxical relation led to the growth of Tzadikism. 3. The mystical ideology of the movement is derived from the Kabbalistic heritage, but its ideas are popularized with an inevitable tendency towards terminological inexactitude. 4. The original contribution of Hasidism to religious thought is bound up with its interpretation of the values of personal and individual existence. General ideas become individual ethical values. The whole development centers around the personality of the Hasidic saint. This is something entirely new. Personality takes the place of doctrine. What is lost in rationality by this change is gained in efficacy. The opinions particular to the exalted individual are less important than his character, and mere learning, knowledge of the Torah, no longer occupies the most important place in the scale of religious values. A tale is told of a famous saint who said, "I did not go to the Maggid of Meseritz to learn Torah from him, but to watch him tie his bootlaces." This pointed and somewhat extravagant saying, which must not, of course, be taken literally, at least throws some light on the complete rationalization of religious values which set in with the cult of the great religious personality. The new ideal of the religious leader, the tzaddik, differs from the traditional ideal of rabbinical Judaism. The Talmud Hakam, our student of the Torah, mainly in that he himself has become Torah. It is no longer his knowledge but his life which lends religious value to his personality. He is the living incarnation of the Torah. Inevitably, the original mystical conception of the bottomless depths within the Torah was soon transferred to the personality of the saint, and in consequence it quickly appeared that the various groups of Hasidism were developing different characteristics in accordance with the particular type of saint to whom they looked for guidance. To establish a common type becomes not a little difficult. In the development of Hasidism, opposing extremes found their place, and the differences between Lithuanian, Polish, Galician, and South Russian Jewry were reflected in the personalities of the saints round whom they were grouped. All of which is not to say that the tzaddik was ever completely one with his environment. The upshot of all this unlimited emotionalism was paradoxically enough a return to rationality. Such paradoxes, by the way, are not infrequent. In the event, the waves went so high that emotion turned against itself. There was a sudden anticlimax. Tzaddikim, such as Rabbi Mendel of Kutzik, the most important among this group, and generally speaking, one of the most remarkable personalities, not a saint, but a true spiritual leader in Jewish religious history, began to inveigh against the extravagant sentimentalism which the cult of religious emotion had produced. Notably among the Jews in Poland, strict rational discipline suddenly becomes a fetish. The rabbi of Kotzik had no sympathy for the Hasidic community, whose yoke he bore only with the greatest reluctance. He hates emotionalism. In reply to an inquiry about man's way to God, he is credited with the frank and laconic answer in scriptural language. In Numbers 31:53, the man of war had taken spoil, every man for himself. After an interval of 100 years, during which Hasidism as a whole, apart from the solitary figure of Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Ladi, developed independently of the rabbinic tradition, there occurred a revival of rabbinic learning, chiefly under the influence of the Rabbi of Kotzik. We find Tzaddikism, who write rabbinical responsa and works of pilpul, that is to say, hair-splitting casuistry. But important as these aspects of later Hasidism no doubt are, they certainly represent a departure from what is new and original in Hasidism. There this sort of learning was no consequence, everything was mystery, if not exactly mystery in the Kabbalistic sense, for compared with the peculiar note of Hasidic emotionalism, even the Kabbalistic mystery has a rational character. Now it is dissolved into personality, and in this transformation it acquires a new intensity. The miraculous thing about it all is the fact that Hasidism did not conflict much more sharply with Orthodox Judaism than it did, and yet everything seemed to move towards a mortal struggle. The personality of the tzaddik, its interpretation by the Hasidic writers, their insistence upon his supreme religious authority, his elevation to the rank of a source of canonical inspiration, of a medium of revelation, all this fairly compelled a clash with the recognized religious authority of Rabbinic Judaism. Such a conflict broke out with great vehemence in many localities. The Gaon Elijah of Vilna, or Elijah, not sure how you pronounce whether you say it as a J or Y in that language. The outstanding leader of Lithuanian Jewry, and an excellent representative of the highest rabbinical learning, combined with the strictly theistic Orthodox Kabbalism, took the lead in 1772 in an organized persecution of the new movement. Nor were the Orthodox squeamish about the means that were employed in this struggle. As late as 1800, fanatical opponents of Hasidism tried to induce the Russian government to take action against it. The history of these organized persecutions and of the Hasidic defense against them has been fully described by Simeon Dubnow. There can be no doubt that the Hasidism cherished a feeling of moral superiority over their contemporaries, which has found expression in the writings of some famous Hasidic authors. One could easily make a collection of Hasidic epigrams which breathe a spirit not very far removed from that of Sabbateanism. The Hasidic tzaddik, too, is occasionally compelled to descend to a lower or even dangerous plane in order to rescue the scattered sparks of light, for every descent of the tzaddik means an elevation of divine light. And yet, Hasidism did not go the way of Sabbateanism. Its leaders were far too closely connected with the life of the community to succumb to the dangers of sectarianism. Opportunities were not lacking, yet these men